The Jack the Ripper case is officially closed.
Why has this case gripped the globe? It is not an American fascination. It's not a British fascination. It is a global fascination.
That is not a theory. It is a scientific fact backed by modern DNA technology. For 137 years, the world has been obsessed with a ghost, chasing shadows of royal conspiracies and mad doctors. But here is the catch. The answer was never in a lost diary or a secret government file. It was hidden in plain sight on a stained, tattered piece of silk that police ignored for over a century.
Two British scientists are finally revealing the DNA evidence they say helped solve one of history's biggest crime mysteries, the identity of Jack the Ripper.
Two British scientists have finally unlocked its secrets, and the name they found changes everything we thought we knew. Science versus legend. You have probably heard the wild theories. People claim the Freemasons orchestrated the attacks to cover up a royal scandal involving Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson. It makes for a great movie plot, but here is the catch. The evidence that finally unmasked him wasn't a complex conspiracy. It was a piece of fabric allegedly found at the scene of the Ripper's fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, on September 30th, 1888. This shawl was passed down through the family of a policeman who was at the scene.
Now, 137 years on from the killings, the descendants of his victims are hopeful that the truth can finally be revealed. It all comes down to a shawl found beside one of the women killed.
For decades, it was just a morbid curiosity sitting in a drawer. Most experts dismissed it as a fake, just one more piece of ripperbilia in a market flooded with scams. But it is not that simple, though. In 2007, an author and amateur sleuth named Russell Edwards bought it at an auction. He was convinced it was the real deal. He staked his money and his reputation on one final desperate gamble, to use technology the Victorian police could not even dream of. Edwards tracked down Dr. Jari Luhelen, a world-renowned expert in genetic analysis from old degraded samples at Liverpool John Moores University. This wasn't like a fresh TV crime show where they get a result in 5 minutes. This was a piece of silk that was over 125 years old at the time of the test. It was contaminated by countless hands, by time, and by the elements. Getting anything from it was considered a miracle. Dr. Luhelen and his team got to work in a sterile lab. They focused on the stains. Using advanced techniques, they carefully extracted the microscopic genetic material left behind. They were looking for something called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA.
The DNA doesn't really lie, so if you have a long stretch of human DNA that doesn't appear from nowhere, so that's how sure we can be.
What most people don't realize is that mtDNA is a genetic time traveler. Unlike regular DNA, which is a mix from both parents, you only get mtDNA from your mother. She got it from her mother and so on, passed down in an unbroken female line for thousands of years. It is tough, it lasts a long time, and it is the perfect tool for cracking a historical cold case. The first test was simple but critical. Was the shawl even real? The team tracked down a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes' sister. They took a sample and compared it to the DNA from the bloodstains on the shawl. It was a perfect match. The shawl was real. It had been at the scene, soaked in the victim's blood. That alone was a massive discovery. But then they found something else. Mixed in with the victim's DNA were other trace samples, specifically samples consistent with bodily fluids. This was it. This was the perpetrator's genetic signature left behind in his moment of horrific rage. Now came the final step. Edwards and the team had a prime suspect, a man whose name was already whispered in the original police files. They tracked down a living female line descendant of that suspect's sister. They got a sample. They ran the test. Again, it was a match. After 137 years, the science pointed with 100% certainty to one man. And it is not who you think. It wasn't a prince, it wasn't a doctor, it wasn't a famous artist. His name was Aaron Kosminski. But knowing the name is only half the battle. Knowing why he was free is the real shock. But the police actually had him in custody years before anyone realized the truth. The Barber of Whitechapel. The name Aaron Kosminski means nothing to most people. It is not a name that sells books or inspires blockbuster movies, and that is exactly the point. The wow factor here is not that the Ripper was a glamorous celebrity. The wow factor is that he was a 23-year-old Polish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in the very heart of Whitechapel. He was not a phantom. He was a local, and the police knew exactly who he was. Kosminski had fled Poland, then part of the Russian Empire, to escape the brutal pogroms and had arrived in London with his family, settling in the East End. By all accounts, he was a deeply troubled man. He was known to be mentally unwell, suffering from what modern experts believe was paranoid schizophrenia. He was plagued by dark visions, auditory hallucinations, and a profound violent hatred of women.
This is a killer who hated women and wanted to do maximum damage to them. So it immediately gives off this sort of cinematic image of this sinister character in a black coat.
This isn't just speculation. This is what the police at the time believed. While the public and the newspapers were going insane over the Dear Boss letters and theories about mad doctors, the top cops on the case were quietly building their own shortlist. And Kosminski's name was at the very top. Chief Constable Melville McNaughton wrote a famous internal memo in 1894 that named Kosminski as a primary suspect. He described him as a man who had a strong homicidal tendency and an intense hatred of women. But here is the catch. The most chilling evidence, the real bombshell, comes from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. Swanson was the man who oversaw the entire Ripper investigation. He was on the ground every single day. Years later, after he retired, he got a copy of his boss's memoirs. In the margin of the book, right next to the section about the Ripper case, Swanson scribbled a private note. He wrote that the perpetrator was Kosminski, the man who was sent to an asylum and perished there. This is history-changing. The officer in charge of the case privately confirmed the man's identity. And get this, Kosminski lived right in the middle of the slaying locations. If you look at a map of the crimes, they form a tight cluster. Right in the center of that cluster was Kosminski's home. He knew the alleys, he knew the shortcuts, he knew how to disappear because he lived there. He was known to be violent, and then in 1891 his family finally had him committed to an asylum where he stayed for the rest of his life. And when did the Jack the Ripper slaying stop? Exactly when Aaron Kosminski was taken off the streets. The DNA, the timeline, and the secret police testimony all point to one terrified and violent man. He was the monster. It sounds so simple now, doesn't it? He was a known threat. He was violent. He lived in the area. But you have to ask yourself, if the police suspected him, why was he never arrested? Why was there no trial? The answer lies in the unique chaos of the Victorian justice system. They didn't have the hard proof. They couldn't just run a DNA test or check fingerprints. They needed a witness to catch him in the act, and in the dark, fog-choked streets of London, witnesses were unreliable at best. Kosminski eventually died in the asylum in 1919, weighing only about 90 pounds. He took his secrets to the grave, or so he thought. But the shawl survived. It traveled through time, carrying the only thing that could convict him. But to truly understand why he was able to operate, you have to understand the environment. He wasn't hunting in a normal city. He was hunting in a place that was essentially designed to hide a monster.
This one smallish area of the East End of London, Whitechapel, was a magnet for not only the very poor people, people who had menial jobs, for example, but also the actually destitute, the people who had reached the very bottom rung of the ladder.
The city itself was an accomplice, providing a cloak of darkness that no light could penetrate. The pea souper. To understand the terror, you have to understand the world that hid him. The London of 1888 was not the charming city of top hats and carriages you see in movies, and that is putting it lightly. It was a tale of two cities. While the rich lived in grand houses in the West, the East End, especially Whitechapel, was a living nightmare. It was one of the most crowded, diseased, and desperate places on earth. Whitechapel was an area where you had a lot of homeless drifters. You had what were known as the common lodging houses. Over 900,000 people were crammed into a few square miles, a tangled mess of narrow, unlit streets, dark alleys, and hidden courtyards. We are talking about population densities of over 1,000 people per acre. To put that in perspective, that is 4 times more crowded than modern-day New York City. The air itself was toxic. A thick yellow pea super fog, a mix of river mist and black coal smoke from thousands of chimneys, choked the city. This fog was so dense you sometimes couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. It was the perfect cover for a predator. You could be standing 5 feet away from a crime and see nothing. The gas lamps didn't help, they just created flickering pools of light that made the shadows even deeper. There was no safety net. Poverty wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. The heart of this world was the lodging house or doss house. These were filthy, horrible places where you could rent a bed or even just a spot on the floor for a few pennies a night. Some offered a 4-penny coffin, which was literally a coffin-shaped wooden box to sleep in. Others just had a rope strung across the room for men to lean on as they slept standing up. For the women who became the Ripper's victims, life was a constant daily struggle to find those doss pennies. They would do anything for the price of a bed just to avoid sleeping in a dark alley.
Women who would not normally engage in prostitution, sometimes hawking their bodies, to make any kind of money just to get perhaps a bed for the night.
This is what made them so vulnerable. They were not glamorous, they were middle-aged, poor, and desperate women. Mary Ann Nichols, Needy Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They were trying to survive one more day. They had to walk the streets late at night in the fog and the dark, looking for any way to earn the price of their bed. What most people don't realize is that this environment didn't just hide the monster, it helped him. The maze-like layout of Whitechapel meant that anyone who knew the area could vanish instantly. There were hundreds of alleyways that led to nowhere or connected to other streets in ways only a local would know. Kosminski, living there, working there, walking those streets every day, would have known exactly which corners were dark and which alleys were empty. The sanitation was practically non-existent. Slaughterhouses were located right next to residential homes. Animals were butchered on the streets, meaning blood was a common sight. A man with blood on his clothes might not even draw a second glance in a neighborhood full of butchers and slaughtermen. It was the perfect camouflage. They were trying to police a population that didn't trust them, in a place they barely understood, with tools that were centuries out of date. And just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the media decided to get involved. The press didn't just report the news, they created a phantom that paralyzed the world. When a criminal became a legend with the city screaming for answers, the London Metropolitan Police launched one of the biggest manhunts in history. They flooded Whitechapel with officers. They interviewed over 2,000 people. They detained and questioned at least 80 men. They followed every single lead. So why did they fail? Yeah, about that. They weren't just fighting a man, they were fighting the time they lived in. And they were fighting a media circus that they helped create. First, there was no such thing as forensic science. The concept of a crime scene was brand new. When a victim was found, crowds would rush in, reporters would trample over evidence. The scene would be contaminated in minutes. Police had no fingerprinting, they had no blood typing. All they had were witness reports from people in dark, foggy streets. Some said he looked shabby, others said he looked respectable. It was useless. What is truly wild is that they did find clues, but they didn't know what to do with them. Near the scene of Catherine Eddowes, the same victim from the shawl, they found a piece of her bloody apron. On the wall above it, someone had written in chalk, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was it a clue from the perpetrator? Was Kosminski, who was Jewish, trying to frame his own people? Or was it just anti-Semitic graffiti? We will never know. So do you think the case is finally closed? Does the DNA evidence convince you that Aaron Kosminski was the real Jack the Ripper? Or is the shawl just a contaminated piece of history? This mystery has survived for over a century. Maybe we just don't want it to end. Let me know your verdict in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, smash that like button and subscribe for more mysteries solved by science. Thanks for watching.